You fool! Warren is dead.
Welcome to HorrorBabble. I'm back today with a classic by the great Robert Bloch, The Grinning Ghoul. First appearing in Weird Tales back in June of 1936, the story was described as follows: a story of stark horror in the subterranean depths beneath the tomb. Sounds like my kind of place. And without further ado, The Grinning Ghoul by Robert Bloch. 1. Fate plays strange tricks on one, doesn't it? 6 months ago, I was a well-known and moderately successful practicing psychiatrist. Today, I'm an inmate of a sanatorium for mental cases. In my capacity of alienist and physician, I have often committed patients to the selfsame institution in which I myself am now confined, and today, irony of ironies, I find myself their brother in misfortune. And yet I am not really mad. They sent me here because I chose to tell the truth, and it was not the kind of truth men dare to reveal or recognize. I acknowledge that my part in the matter led me to suffer a severe nervous breakdown, but it did not derange me. My story is true, I swear to it. But they will not believe. Of course, I really have no substantial proof to offer. I have never seen Professor Chopin since that eventful night last August, and my subsequent investigations failed to substantiate his claim to a post at Newbury College. This, however, only testifies to the validity of my statement, a statement which sent me to shameful confinement, to a living death which I abhor. There is one other concrete proof which I could give if I dared, but that would be too terrible. I must not lead them to the exact spot in that nameless cemetery and point out the passage that yawns beneath that tomb. No, it is better that I should suffer alone, that the world at large be spared the knowledge that destroys sanity. Yet it is hard for me to live like this, and to the drabness of my days my nighted dreams add endless torment. That is why I choose to set down this account. Perhaps the unfolding of my story will serve somehow to ease the painful burden of my memory. The affair began one day last August at my downtown office. It had been a dull vigil that morning, and the long, hot afternoon was nearly over when the nurse ushered in the first patient. It was a gentleman who had never consulted me heretofore, a man who gave his name as Professor Alexander Chopin of Newbury College. He spoke sibilantly, with a peculiar foreign intonation which led me to assume that he was not a native of this country. I requested him to be seated, and tried to appraise him quickly as he complied with my invitation. He was tall and thin. His hair was startlingly white, almost platinum, yet his general physique and appearance were that of a man of 40. His green, unwavering eyes were deeply set in a pale, protruding forehead, and were surmounted by long, jet-black brows. The nose was large, with sensual nostrils, but his lips were thin, a physical contradiction which I immediately noticed. The lean hands resting on the table were exceedingly small, with long, tapering fingers terminating in lengthy nails, probably cultivated for use in reading and reference work, I decided. His supple posture was akin to that of a panther in repose. He had the foreigner's ease and graceful manner. In the sunlight I was able to observe his face, and I discovered his entire countenance to be covered with a network of tiny wrinkles. I noted, too, the peculiar pallor of his skin, which indicated some dermatological disturbance. But by far the queerest thing about him was his unusual mode of dress. His clothes, while obviously new, were incongruous in two respects. They were formal attire in midday, and they did not seem to fit him. They were curiously large, his striped grey trousers sagged, and his coat bulged strangely. There was dried mud on his patent leather pumps, and he carried no hat. Obviously he was an eccentric type, a schizophrenic perhaps, with tendencies toward hypochondria. I prepared to ask him the routine questions, but he intervened. He was a busy man, he told me, and he would inform me at once of his difficulty, without unnecessary preliminaries or introductions. He settled himself back in his chair, where the sunlight faded into shadow, cleared his throat nervously, and began. He was troubled, he said, because of certain things he had heard and read of. They sent him queer dreams and often caused him spells of uncontrollable melancholia. This was interfering with his work, and yet he could do nothing, for his obsessions were founded on reality. Finally, he had decided to come to me for an analysis of his difficulties. I asked him for an account of his dreams and fancies, half expecting to hear one of the usual image patterns of the dyspeptic. My assumption, however, proved to be woefully incorrect. The most commonplace dream revolved around what I shall call the Misericord Cemetery, for reasons soon to be apparent. This is a large, ancient, half-abandoned tract in the oldest section of the city, which flourished in the latter part of the past century. The exact location of his nocturnal vision was in and around a certain secluded vault situated in the most dilapidated and archaic portion of the graveyard. The incidents of the dream always occurred at nightfall, beneath a waning and sepulchral moon. Fantastic visions seemed to brood somberly over the midnight landscape, and he spoke vaguely of half-heard voices that seemed to urge him onward as he found himself on the gravel walk that led to the doors of the tomb. His dreams usually began in this fashion, in the midst of a sound slumber. He would suddenly be walking up a tree-shaded pathway in the night, and enter this tomb by unfastening the rusted chains that barred its portal. Once inside, he seemed to experience no difficulty in guiding his footsteps through the darkness, but with uncanny familiarity would go at once to a certain niche among the biers. He then knelt and pressed a tiny concealed spring or lever set in the crumbling stones of the floor. A pivot would revolve at the base of the niche and reveal to him a small opening leading to a mouldering cavern below. He spoke here of the nitrous dampness that emanated from this passageway, and the peculiarly nauseous odors of the denser darkness that rose from below. Nevertheless, in his dream he was not repelled, but would immediately enter the chasm and subsequently descend a succession of interminably long staircases cut in stone and earth. Abruptly, he would find himself at the bottom. Then began another lengthy journey through endless labyrinthine caverns and charnel vaults. On and on he wandered, through cave and crypt, tunnel and abyss-burrowed pit, all cloaked in the blackness of immemorial night. Here he paused in his narrative, and his voice shrank to a shrill, excited whisper. The horror always came next. He would suddenly emerge into a series of dimly lighted chambers, and as he stood undetected in the shadows, he would see things. These were the dwellers that laired beneath, the ghastly spawn that ravened on the dead. They dwelt in nighted caverns lined with human bones and adored the primal gods before altars shaped of skulls. They had tunnels leading to the graves and burrows still farther below in which they stalked a living prey. These were the grisly night gaunts that he beheld in dreams. These were ghouls. He must have seen the look in my face, but he did not falter. His voice, as he continued, became very tense. He would not attempt to describe these creatures, save to say that they were very horrible to look upon, in ways peculiarly obscene. It was easy for him to recognize them for what they were, because of certain significant acts they always performed. It was the sight of these acts, more than anything else, which made him afraid. There are some things that should not even be hinted at to sane minds, and the things that haunted him nightly were among them. In his visions, these beings did not accost him, and were seemingly unmindful of his presence. They continued to indulge in eldritch feastings in the charnel chambers, or join in orgies without a name. But of this he would say no more. His nocturnal flights always ended with the passage of a vast procession of these monstrosities through a cavern still farther beneath, a journey which he would view from a ledge above. Shuddery glimpses into the realms below led him to recall tales of the inferno, and he would cry out in his sleep. As he watched that demon processional from the brink, he would suddenly lose his footing and be precipitated into the charnel swarm below. Here, his dream would mercifully end, and he would awake, bathed in icy sweat. Night after night the visions had come, but this was not the worst of his troubles. His real and besetting fear lay in his knowledge that the visions were true. Here I impatiently interrupted, but he insisted upon continuing. Had he not visited the cemetery after the first few dreams, and did he not actually find the very vault he had learned to recognize through his dreams? And what about the books? He had been led to institute some extensive research among the private volumes of the college anthropological library. Surely I, as an enlightened and educated man, must admit the veiled and subtle truths so furtively revealed in such tomes as Ludwig Prin's Mysteries of the Worm, or the grotesque black rites of mystic Luva Caraf, the priest of cryptic Bast. He had made some studies recently in the mad and legendary Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred. I could not refute the arcana behind such things as the banned and infamous fable of Nyarlathotep, or the legend of the Elder Sabbath. Here he broke off into a rambling discourse of obscure secret myths, with frequent allusions to such shadows of antique lore as fabled Leng, lightless Ken, and demon-haunted Nis, spoke too of such blasphemies as the moon of Yugurath, and the secret parable of Bayaguna, the Faceless One. Obviously, these incoherent ravings provided the key to his difficulty, and with some argument I succeeded in calming him sufficiently to tell him so. His readings and research had brought on this attack, I explained. He must not tax his brain with such speculations. These things are dangerous to normal minds. I had read and learned enough of such things to know that such ideas were not meant for men to seek or understand. Besides, he must not take these thoughts too seriously, for after all, these tales were merely allegorical. There are no such things as ghouls and demons. He must see that his dreams could be symbolically interpreted. He sat in silence for a moment after I concluded. He sighed, then spoke very deliberately. These things were all very well for me to say, but he knew differently. Had he not recognized the place of his dreams? I interjected a remark about the influence of the subconscious mind, but he disregarded my assertion and continued. Then he informed me, in a voice that quavered with almost hysterical excitement, he would tell me the worst. He had not yet told me all there was to know about what had occurred when he discovered the vault of his dreams in the cemetery. He had not stopped at this corroboration of his visions. Some nights ago, he had gone farther. He had entered the necropolis and found the niche in the wall, descended the stairs, and come upon the rest. How he managed to return, he never knew. But on all three of these excursions to the scene, he had come back and apparently gone to sleep. The following morning, he always was in bed. It was the truth, he told me. He had seen the things. Now I must help him at once before he did something rash. I calmed him with difficulty, meanwhile trying to hit upon a logical and effective method of treatment. He was obviously near to a dangerous mental lesion. There would be no use trying to persuade or convince him that he had dreamed the latter incidents as he had the former, that his nervous system had subjected him to sympathetic hallucinations. I could not hope to make him realize in his present state that the books responsible for his affliction were merely the mad ravings of disordered minds. Obviously, the only course remaining open was to humor him, and then concretely demonstrate the utter fallacy of his beliefs. Therefore, in response to his reiterated pleas, we struck a bargain. He was to undertake to guide me to the place where he claimed his journeys and his dreams had been located, and then prove to me the truth of what he stated. In short, at 10 o'clock upon the following evening, I agreed to meet him at the graveyard. His pleasure at this arrangement was almost pathetic to see. He smiled upon me like a fond child with a newly bestowed plaything. Obviously, he was glad of my decision. I prescribed a mild sedative to be taken by him that evening, arranged the minor details of our forthcoming tryst and undertaking, then dismissed him until the following night. His departure left me in a state of great excitement. Here, at last, was a case worthy of study. A well-educated, seemingly intelligent college professor subject to the ogreish nightmares of a 3-year-old infant. I forthwith determined to write a monograph upon the subsequent proceedings. I felt sure that upon the following evening I could conclusively demonstrate the fallacy of his aberration and effect an immediate cure. The night was spent in a frenzy of research and calculated speculation. The following morning in a hasty perusal of the expurgated edition of Comte de Let's Culte de Ghoul. Nightfall found me ready for the business at hand. At 10 o'clock, clad in hip boots, rough woolen jacket, miner's cap with candle in its brim, I was standing at the cemetery entrance. I felt fully prepared for the coming of Professor Alexander Chopin. Still, I must confess to an uneasy and inexplicable nyctophobia. I did not relish the unpleasant task to follow. Suddenly, I found myself anxiously awaiting the arrival of my patient, if only for the sake of companionship. He came at last, similarly attired, and seemingly in better spirits. Together we scaled the low stone wall surrounding the necropolis. Then he led me across the moonlit garden of graves and into the creeping shadows of a silent grove in the heart of the cemetery. Here, the tombstones leered crazily amid the darkness, and the rays of the moon fell not. Some atavistic dread caused me to repress an involuntary shudder, as my mind dwelt unbidden upon the fearful trafficking of the worms below. Ugh! I did not care to let my thoughts rest upon the grave earth, or the diabolic density of the encircling shadows. I was relieved when Chopin, unperturbed, led me at last up a long avenue of towering trees to the forbidding portals of the tomb he claimed to have profaned. 2. I cannot bear to dwell in detail upon that which followed. I shall not tell you of how we unfastened the chains that barred the tomb, or describe the grim interior of the mausoleum. It is enough for me to state that Chopin's promise was fulfilled, for he found the niche by the light of the candles we wore upon our miner's caps, found the niche and pressed the secret spot, so that the tunnel from below was revealed. I stood aghast at this unexpected revelation, and a sudden blast of fear stabbed my senses into unnatural tenseness. I must have stood gazing into that sable orifice for many minutes. Neither of us spoke. For the first time, I hesitated. No longer did I have any doubts concerning the validity of the professor's statements. He had proven them beyond the shadow of a doubt. Still, this did not mean that he was wholly sane. It did not cure him of his obsession. I realized, with a repulsion I could not then explain, that my task was far from ended, that we must descend into those nether depths and settle once and for all the questions yet unanswered. I was not prepared to believe Chopin's incoherent rigmarole about imaginary ghouls. The mere existence of a tomb passage did not necessarily tend to substantiate his other claim. Perhaps if I went with him to the termination of the pit, his mind could be put at rest regarding his singular suspicions. But, and I dreaded to acknowledge the possibility, just supposing there really was some malign, distorted truth in his story of what lurked and abided there below. Some band of refugees, fugitives from the law perchance, who might actually denizen the pit. Perhaps accident had led them to stumble upon this unusual hiding place. If so, what then? Still, in this event, something told me that we would have to go on and see for ourselves. To this inward prompting, Chopin added his vocal pleas. Let him show me the truth, he said, and I could no longer doubt. After that I would believe, and with belief alone could I help. He was begging me to go on, but if I refused he would have to take recourse in a police investigation of the place. It was this last point that determined me. I could not afford to see my name mixed up in a mess that involved such spectacular opportunities for scandal. If the man were mad, I could take care of myself. If not, well, we would soon see. Accordingly, I gave reluctant consent to proceeding, then stepped aside for him to lead the way. The opening gaped like the mouth of a mythic monster. Down we went, down a serpentine, slanting stairway in the damp stone passage that was chiseled out of solid rock. The tunnel was hot and humid, and upon the air was the odor of putrefying life. It was like a journey through the most fantastic realms of nightmare, a journey that led to unknown crypts beneath the corpse earth. Here were things secret to all but the worms, and as we continued, I began to wish that they might remain so. I was actually becoming panicky, though Chopin seemed oddly calm. Several factors contributed to my growing unease. I did not like the stealthy rats that chittered ceaselessly from countless tiny burrows that lined the second spiral of the passage. An army of them swarmed the stairs, all sleek and fat and bloated. I began to conceive some peculiar notions as to the cause of that bloating, and the probable sources of their nocturnal nourishment. Then, too, I noticed that Chopin seemed to know the way quite well, and if it were true that he had been here before, then what about the rest of his story? My eyes, glancing down the stairs, received still another shock. There was no dust on the steps. They looked as if they were constantly in use. For a moment, my mind refused to comprehend the import of this discovery, but when at last it burst full-blown upon my brain, I felt suddenly stunned. I did not dare to look again, lest my ready imagination conjure up the probable image of what might ascend that stairway from below. Hastily dissembling my childish dread, I hurried on after my silent conductor, whose candle threw strange shadows on pitted walls. I realized that I was beginning to be nervous about this whole affair, and I vainly tried to reason myself out of my fears by concentrating on some definite object. There certainly was nothing reassuring about our surroundings as we proceeded. The leering, crazily burrowed walls of the tunnel looked ghastly in the torchlight. I suddenly felt that this ancient pathway had not been built by anything normal or akin to sanity, and I dared not let my thoughts impinge on the ultimate revelations which might lie ahead. For a long time we crept on in stark silence. Down, 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 our way ever narrowed into a deeper, damper darkness. Then the staircase abruptly terminated in a cave. There was a bluish light, phosphorescent as ultraviolet, and I wondered as to its source. It revealed a small, smooth-surfaced open area, overhung with rows of colossal stalactites and vast basic pylons of massive breadth. Beyond, in the denser dark, were openings to other burrows, leading to seemingly endless vistas of forgotten night. An air of creeping horror froze my heart. We seemed to have profaned in our intrusion some mysteries better left unsought. I began to tremble, But Chopin gripped me roughly and dug his thin fingers into my shoulders as he told me to keep silent. He whispered as we huddled side by side in that dim and twilit cavern under the earth, whispered awesomely of what he said lurked and shambled in the darkness just beyond. He would prove now that his words were true. I must wait here while he ventured into the black beyond. When he returned, he would bring me proof. So saying, he rose and walked swiftly forward, disappearing almost immediately into one of the burrows just ahead. He left me so suddenly that I did not even have time to voice my objections to his proposal. I sat there in the darkness and waited. I dared not guess for what. Would Chopin return? Was it all a monstrous hoax? Was Chopin mad, or was it all true? If so, what might not happen to him in that labyrinth beyond, and what might happen to me? I had been a fool ever to think of coming. The whole thing was insane. Perhaps those books were not so absurd as I had thought. The earth may nurse hideous secrets in its ageless breast. The blue light cast screening shadows on the stalactitic walls and crowded closely around the dim circle of luminance afforded by my tiny torch. I did not like those shadows. They were distorted, unhealthy, disconcertingly deep. The silence was even more potent. It seemed to hint of nameless things yet to come. It mocked unbearably my growing fear and loneliness. The minutes crawled like maggots on their way, and nothing broke that deadly stillness. Then came the cry. The sudden crescendo of indescribable madness welled upon the entombed air, and my soul cleaved, for I knew what that cry meant. I knew now when it was too late, that Chopin's words were true. But I dared not pause or ponder, for presently there came a soft padding from the far-off darkness, the rustling scrape of frantic movement. I turned and raced up the subterranean staircase with the speed of utter desperation. No need for me to look back. My horrified ears clearly caught the cadence of running feet. I heard nothing but the clamor of those feet or paws until my own breath rasped in my ears as I rounded the first spiral of those interminable stairs. I stumbled upward, gasping and choking, a realization in my soul that ate away every thought save one of deathly fear and grinning horror. Poor Chopin! It seemed to me that the sounds were drawing nearer and nearer. Then came a hoarse barking on the stairs directly below, a bestial growling that sickened me with its semi-human tones, and an accompanying laughter that was loathly with horror. They were coming! I ran on, to the rhythmic thundering of the footfalls below. I dared not glance behind me, but I knew that they were closing the gap. The hairs rose upon my neck as I sped up endless flights that writhed and twisted like a serpent in the earth. I toiled and shrieked aloud, but the baying horrors were at my very heels. On, closer and closer and closer, while my body burned with pain and agony. The stairs ended at last, and I squirmed madly through the narrow opening, while the creatures raced through the darkness, barely 10 yards behind. I made it just as the candle in my cap flickered out. Then I jammed the stone back into place, full in the faces of the foremost oncoming horrors. But as I did so, my dying candle flared up for a single moment, so that I saw the first of my pursuers in the glaring light. Then it went out. I slammed the portal into place and somehow staggered back to the world of men. I shall never forget that night, whatever I do to erase those hideous memories. Never shall I find the sleep I crave. I dare not even kill myself for fear of being buried instead of cremated, though death would be welcome to such as I have become. I shall never forget. For now I know the whole truth of the affair, but there is one memory I would give my soul to blot forever from my brain. That mad moment when I saw the monsters in the torchlight, the laughing, drooling horrors from below. For the first and foremost of them all was the laughing, gloating monster known to men as Professor Chopin. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,